Hey guys, today we're going to be checking out the RTX 4060 at 1080p and 1440p in some modern titles as well as a few older titles. The 4060 released just about 2 years ago and it's due to be replaced by the 5060 in the next week or so, maybe even the next few days. It's based on the 5nm process, as you can see in our GPU Z window here. It released with 8 gigabytes of video memory, and that 8 gigabytes clocked at GDDR6. It's the entry point into the 4000 series of NVIDIA cards, or the Ada Lovelace series of cards. There is no 4050 for this generation of cards, so this would be the cheapest possible entry point for the 40 series. The version of the card that we're going to be using is the GIGABYTE Gaming OC version, which is a triple fan version of the 4060, which offers a little bit better airflow, but typically this card is pretty power efficient, and the two fan models will handle it just fine. You can see, of course, resizable bar is enabled here. We're not doing any sort of manual overclock here, although it does have a BIOS switch that is set to overclock. All that does is just simply change the fan profile. And what's notable about this card when we look at this Steam hardware survey is if you look at the most popular GPUs, the second and third place GPU are the 4060. And the second place GPU is the desktop version at 4.6% of users reporting use of that card. The third place being the 4060 laptop version, which is a different GPU, but it is interesting to see that people with a 4060 makes up almost 10% of the user base on Steam, which is pretty incredible. Now, continuing that same string of thinking, if we look at the most popular resolutions, you may think, why are we testing at 1080p? It's 2025. Well, over half of all users still play primarily at 1080p. So it is important to note that although many enthusiasts and a lot of people who really, like PC gaming have moved on from 1080p, it's still an incredibly popular resolution. With the second place most popular resolution being 1440p at 19%. Going to 4K, we only have 4% of players playing at 4K primarily. Now, if we look at the market for the GPU, you can see you can still buy the card new. It's $330. I probably wouldn't advise buying it new right now just due to the fact that the 5060 is due to come out very, very soon. However, if we looked at the used market, you can see that you can save some money on these cards. You can see this guy got a PNY for $300. This person bought one for $250, a Zotac version. And this one sold for only $190. So if you're willing to look, right now they're probably around $250 to $300, but you can definitely get a good deal on them in the used market if you keep your eyes peeled for them. Here's another one at $225. So it is a really compelling card as far as price goes. We're going to be pairing the card with the 9800X3D and 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. So we shouldn't be CPU bottlenecked in any scenario whatsoever. There are a few games that may perform a bit better on a higher end CPU, which I will be sure to call out. But typically, all this is going to let us do is have enough headroom to properly test the card. All right, here we are in Assassin's Creed Shadows, starting off at 1080p using the DLS quality preset with frame generation set to off. And we're on the medium overall preset here, which still does have ray trace global illumination diffuse plus specular everywhere. And here, as you can see, we start counting. We're getting right about 60 FPS. At 1080p, thankfully, it's not really pushing our VRAM utilization too high. Those three fans are keeping our card very cool at just 51 degrees. And a very solid, smooth FPS here, not too many dips. And a real solid performance here at 1080p. This is a game that even on higher end hardware does have a hard time, even at lower resolutions. So it is definitely nice to see that even without using any sort of frame generation, we are able to get a nice smooth 60 FPS here. We did not inject the new DLSS model, so we're still using the CNN model, which you can see doesn't really handle reflections all that well. But some of the wind effects and things like that with the transformer model don't look great either, so you kind of have to pick your poison. Now, changing our resolution up to 1440p, keeping all of the same settings on, medium preset, only the quality, frame generation. You can see we're getting around 50 FPS here, running around about a, 10 to 15 FPS drop here. Not great, but not terrible. Still a pretty smooth experience. The visual just doesn't look quite as smooth, with that bit of drop. However, at 54, 55 FPS averages here, this does make it a good candidate for some frame generation. So let's see how that looks. So with frame generation off, again, you can ignore the frame time graph for frame generation. It doesn't really work properly, but we're able to get a much smoother experience. And because we're not coming from a super low FPS, you know, the 50 range, a single player title like this, totally playable and, in my opinion, worth the trade-off of maybe a little bit of input latency, but nothing too bad. You're still, you know, here you'd still be able to perform your counters and everything like that without any real issue. So yeah, definitely a real solid experience here. I think, you know, if you, on this particular card, if you wanted a higher refresh rate experience at 1440p, you're better off utilizing some of that frame generation, which is, of course, you know, it's a perk of the card, so nothing wrong with using a bit of frame generation in a single player title like this. But overall, solid experience. The VRAM doesn't really come into play here at 1080p or 1440p so long as you keep the settings down. But if you do bump some of the settings up higher, even at 1080p, you'll run into that VRAM limiter. So just to show where that VRAM does kind of come to a factor, the fact that we only have 8 gigabytes here, we're back at the 1080p option here with the same settings with frame generation now turned off. And if we do go in here and even just change medium, not even to ultra high, but just bump it up 2 settings up to very high and apply and do our restart here, we'll see just how that impacts the VRAM and then drastically impacts our performance. So here you can see we're at that preset. It's not impacting us too much, but as we begin moving around, running around, loading in some new textures, you'll slowly see that VRAM start to creep up. And as soon as we hit right around there at 8 gigabytes, you'll notice our FPS plummets down into unplayable territory, as you can see. It's running into those huge stutters. It's running into a VRAM limitation. So even at 1080p, that's where that VRAM does cause an issue. It's loading in these new, new areas while the old areas are not able to be loaded out in time and causes an issue. So it doesn't happen all the time. We did catch it there, thankfully. That is an example of kind of what you can see, but you don't really want to be brushing up against the VRAM limit like we are now. You know, you can get away with it at certain times in certain situations, but oftentimes, you know, you will come into parts where it just makes the game unplayable for bits and pieces at a time. So, you know, you can get away with playing this game. You're just going to have to, on this particular card, with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM, you will have to dump down some of the settings so that, you know, the textures are slightly lower. They're not as large of files to load in, and you have a little bit of wiggle room. But, you know, a lot of times you'll get away with it. Like you can see here, we are running around for a pretty long time here without really coming into any major problems. But those spikes and those stutters like we saw there a moment ago, they do happen. And it is something that is unfortunately a drawback of having an 8 gigabyte card. Next up, we have Black Myth Wukong, which should be interesting considering it's not a super well optimized game, but it does have a lot of different technologies that we can kind of play with. So just to set a baseline, we're playing at 1080p with VSync turned to off. We are on max settings, which is the cinematic settings, and we're using TSR, which is Epic's baked into Unreal Engine upscaling anti-aliasing technology, set to max. So it's just using the anti-aliasing, otherwise playing at native resolution. There's actually no way or no easy way without editing game files to actually completely turn, you know, anti-aliasing off completely and play it native. So this will be kind of the closest. TSR at 100 is slightly less, you know, affecting performance than something like DLAA on a card like this. So using TSR native here at 1080p, you can see it's pretty much an unplayable experience. The game does look great. Not a game that I would really like to play at, you know, at 30 FPS personally. You do feel some of the, it doesn't feel like very responsive. Obviously the frame time is not great with 38 milliseconds going up to there. So yeah, not a great experience to start off with. We'll have to mess with some settings here to see what we can get. So first thing I'd like to do here is just switch over to DLSS. And it's kind of interesting too. It doesn't really have a like super simple way to do this. Basically just drag the slider and it'll tell you what you're on. So if we slide it, you know, down to 50% resolution scale, it tells us we're on performance. So kind of interesting. So we'll go ahead, we'll set performance here and just see how that kind of changes things. So here, keeping on cinematic at performance DLSS, we're still in the 40 range here running around. Still not really where I would prefer to play a game like this at. You see, depending on what we're looking at, if we look at a wall, you see it'll go up maybe to 60, but does not feel smooth whatsoever. You can see the frame time graph, depending on what we're doing, it's kind of going up and down, just does not feel like a smooth experience whatsoever. So because we're only at 1080p and we're not even close to really our performance target, I'm going to actually bump this down all the way to high. And now at high with DLSS on performance, we're getting a much nicer experience. The picture quality looks good. You know, DLSS is an incredible technology. We'll go ahead and start counting here, but we're getting around, mid 80s. Totally fine running around here. Our VRAM usage is right around, the 6.5 gigabyte mark. Not really a point of concern whatsoever so far. This is a particularly heavy area with all this vegetation, a lot of detail everywhere here. So, yeah, certainly, around 100 is definitely playable here. But I would prefer, probably I'd sacrifice a little bit of FPS just to get a little bit sharper of an image. So let's see what we can get maybe at quality upscaling. So dragging our super resolution up to 80% of our resolution scale. You see we are getting a warning here about our performance, but we'll see just how this actually looks if we go ahead. So we are getting a warning that may be it's probably a VRAM warning is what I'm assuming, is that they're noticing that maybe our VRAM will go up after some gameplay. So we're running around here, we're still getting, very solid FPS, 85 average. Doesn't really feel a ton different than like what we're getting before in the 90s, but definitely a bit sharper of an image here in 1080p. All right, so now bumped up to 1440p. So you can see here we're at 1440p, same settings, DLSS set to 80 again, which is quality, and on the high preset here. And if we go ahead and start counting, you see, we can achieve these same settings, and it looks like we're still getting a 60 FPS experience here. Looking around, panning the camera around, still pretty solid experience. The frame time graph is not super out of whack. In fact, it's actually pretty flat. But yeah, certainly this is probably where I'd play 1440p. You're getting 60 FPS pretty much all the time. 1% low, just down to 55. We do have the option for frame generation, though in a game like this, even more so than a game like Assassin's Creed Shadows, where response times are so important, in almost like a Souls-like game. I would not personally advise for frame generation in this case, but yeah, 1440p at these high settings, definitely, at quality upscaling. VRAM usage is still hanging on. It's not really taxing it too much. If we were in like the 7.5 gigabyte territory, I could see it becoming an issue, but really, I think this is actually pretty solid for 1440p here. All right, next up here is Counter-Strike 2. Starting off here at 1080p using the very high preset. So the highest you can go 16 times texture filtering, 8 times MSAA. So we'll go ahead and begin counting here. Game like this, typically on higher end hardware, you will be CPU bound, depending on the CPU that you have. Definitely on a 9800X3D, 99% of the time you'll be CPU bound unless you're playing on lower end hardware, which we are actually playing on lower end hardware here with the 4060, and we are GPU bound. Surprisingly, we must be just barely GPU bound here. But you can see, of course, at high settings, we are getting a high refresh rate experience here. The Source engine, which this game is based on, is a very well optimized engine, and this game really is not really showing any sign of slowing down at all. 240 FPS average. That is basically perfectly populating my 240 hertz screen, so feels absolutely great. Super smooth, super fluid. Now this is deathmatch, which has less effects than a typical game, so we will hop in now and see, with some of the new smoke effects in Counter-Strike 2, do those kind of take, a more significant performance impact than just deathmatch here. So you can see here, we'll go ahead and toss out a smoke. We are still getting that 240, and as soon as we go into the smoke, we do go down here into the 140, so pretty significant impact to our frame rate, but also it happens smooth enough that it's not really super terrible. Still feels pretty solid. It's not really a major problem. So you can see we'll go back in, go back down to the 140s, even 138 looks like was our low there, but still really smooth experience here even with those smokes. All right, next up here, 1440p, same settings here, very high, 8 times MSAA, 16 times texture filtering, native resolution, no FSR. All right, so just as a note, we were getting about 240 at 1080p. So we are here now getting 150. So actually pretty significant a downgrade as far as our FPS goes here at 1440p. The game does look much, much better. Playing here on a 32-inch monitor, certainly, you do notice the difference in clarity at 1440p. But still, high refresh rate experience here, 140, wouldn't complain at all. This is also very high settings. Many people play games like these at low settings to get maximum FPS. Could also utilize FSR to, get even more FPS and reduce a bit of input latency. So this is certainly not a bad experience, but definitely is not reassuring when it comes to the smoke test, which we'll do right now. So 149 FPS here in Deathmatch, and we'll see kind of how it handles a more real-world scenario in a casual match with some effects going on. All right, so here loading into a actual match here, you can see we're getting just about the same FPS. If we go ahead and start counting, pretty much the same FPS, just walking around. Now, if we do go ahead and toss out a smoke, see how far this drops down here as we shoot through it. Goes down to the 80s, which, is not high refresh rate, not great, but it won't really impact, like, your gameplay in a super meaningful way. So you can see we're coming in and out of it. Really 85, lowest I'm really seeing here. Nothing too terrible, that can certainly be addressed with some FSR as well as bumping down some of those settings, but yeah, very high, definitely playable at 1440p as well as 1080p, so long as you're okay, going down into the 80s if you're going into some of those effects, which, in my opinion, not a huge deal. All right, next up here, we have Cyberpunk 2077, starting off here at 1080p, playing on the Ultra preset, and we are going to use our DLSS, and it has the transformer model baked into this game, which is nice. And we're going to go ahead and set it to quality, although there is an argument to be made for setting it to balance because this transformer model looks great even in balanced. So you can see here, this is the Ultra preset, which is no ray tracing, and in my opinion, on lower end hardware like this, game like this, the ray tracing is nice, but I definitely myself prefer a higher refresh rate, and I think the game still looks great even without the ray tracing on. I really think even the baked-in lighting that they have in this game is really, really impressive, and you can see even without any sort of frame generation, just using DLSS at quality no less, we are able to get a 93% or 93 FPS average. Really, really solid experience here, and the game still looks phenomenal. This is definitely how I'd prefer to play it. Now, there are people, I'm sure, who would prefer, a more hyped up visuals and sacrifice some frame rate and implement all these different technologies. But me personally, I'm okay with, this quote unquote bad looking version of the game, which still looks incredible in my opinion, and getting a much higher refresh rate here, and a much more stable refresh rate too, when you're not relying on so many of those technologies. You could, of course, just do a more mild ray tracing and implement quality or balanced FSR or balanced DLSS, but really, in my opinion, the game looks phenomenal here at Ultra, and you're still getting, 87 now FPS average. Really, really, really solid experience here. Now, maintaining these same settings, just at 1440p now, so we're still on the Ultra preset with DLSS set to quality. You can see things get to be a little bit different. So now we're not quite getting those higher refresh rates. Now we're kind of getting, in the 40s, which, depending on who you are, it might be acceptable. In my opinion, I wouldn't play this game at 40 FPS. I want to play it at least 60 FPS. So we're going to have to come in and tweak some stuff. And the first thing that I think is worth tweaking is just the resolution that we are scaling up from, which again, Transformer Model handles this absolutely beautifully. So we're just trying to get to 60 ideally, which just turning that down to balance looks like that gets us to 60 pretty much right away and then some. And like I said, the game still looks really great. The Transformer Model is super impressive. In fact, access to the Transformer Model, I think, is one of the best things about the 40 series cards and the 4060, especially the lower end cards. The fact that you can inject this model into other games too is super, super valuable. So 60 FPS here, using balance, you could dump it down to performance. This is without ray tracing. If you did want to go ray tracing, you would likely have to, implement some more technologies, maybe even frame generation. But this is a good frame generation option because we do have a pretty high base FPS. But the only thing is, if you look at our VRAM, we're not exceeding our VRAM, and it's not causing those stutters that, when VRAM becomes your bottleneck, that, those stutters and huge choppy bits that happen. We're not there yet, but we're close enough that it's kind of making me a bit nervous if we were to turn too many settings up here. So yeah, Ultra with DLSS transformer set to balance. Pretty nice that, to move from 1080p over to 1440p, all you have to do is dump it down to balanced as opposed to quality, and really, I can't really tell a huge difference in the image quality. Now, you're not really getting the 80 FPS, you're you're really solidly in that 60 FPS range, but 60 to 80 FPS is not a major difference. I think 50 to 80 is pretty big, 40 to 80 is pretty massive, but as long as you're over 60, that's typically what I kind of like to be at, as far as, to feel like I'm playing a real smooth experience. But yeah, I mean, 4060 here, definitely a nice card at 1440p, and at Cyberpunk you're able to really get, some of these great visuals at high refresh rates. And this is without even going into our frame generation, which, in my opinion, frame generation for me is kind of a last resort if nothing else really is getting us there. But, looks great, and definitely a solid experience here. Alright, next up here we have Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced Edition. Starting off in full screen 1080p, and we'll be using the maximum RT preset. So the Enhanced Edition does add some things we could use, like DLSS, which I'm actually not going to use for 1080p, and it does also enable ray tracing, which we are going to put on. Doesn't make a huge difference as far as how the game looks, but it's, new to GTA 5 Enhanced, so we'll use it. And the only modification I really have here is turning down motion blur. So you see we have this great car that will show off some of this ray tracing pretty nicely. You can see those pebbles and things like that. Go ahead and start counting here. Now, this is an older game, so it shouldn't be too surprising that we are getting pretty solid FPS here. Now, different people may prioritize different things. If you want, a super high refresh rate experience here, like 120 or something like that, you certainly could enable, your DLSS, but my opinion, at native, it still looks really sharp. The built-in anti-aliasing, which I think they use TAA by default as their, baked-in anti-aliasing. It looks okay, it looks fine. The quality DLSS may give you, like, depending on your opinion, it may give you a slightly sharper image. DLSS as a form of anti-aliasing is actually super strong, even without the DLAA. Even if you do have to, downscale to get there, it still looks really solid. But, as you can see here, 1080p, absolutely shouldn't be a surprise, but totally a playable experience. We're, gigabyte and a half off of our VRAM limit. We're totally fine here and getting a real nice experience near 90 FPS. So still here at maximum settings, the only thing that we've adjusted here is just our resolution. So same exact settings, we're on 1080p, but now at 1440p. So we'll see if that VRAM does climb and cause any problems here at 1440p native max settings here with ray tracing on. You can see, obviously, our FPS did take a hit. We're now right around 60, which GTA 5 still feels great. I put a lot of hours into this game at 30 FPS on Xbox 360, which is pretty crazy that this game has gone through so many iterations and, so many console cycles that's where I originally played it. But yeah, still, pretty solid experience here. But, typically you'd want to be a bit higher than this. So let's go ahead and, we're dipping below 60, which isn't great on, a modern piece of hardware. So let's go ahead and enable some DLSS and see how that looks and how it performs. So let's go ahead. We'll just start real mild here with DLSS quality. I'm not actually sure if this uses the new transformer model or not, or if this just kind of uses, what we've, the CNN model that's a bit more common, but we'll go ahead and we'll enable it, and right off the bat, the image still looks totally sharp. You can't really even tell much of anything, and that does give us a pretty significant FPS boost here. So rather than fighting to be in that 60 range. Now we're real cleanly in that 60 range, right around, 75 plus FPS here. So definitely a much stronger experience with DLSS. Super nice to finally have those technologies kind of implemented in this game natively, so you don't have to, do any trickery to kind of get that stuff to work. But yeah, definitely a real strong experience here in GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, even on the 4060, which, like we said in the beginning, is you can get it for like less than $300 a lot of times. And the fact that you can play at 1440p, a newer title and a super popular title at these high FPS, just goes to show the value that these cards hold, All right, next game here is Monster Hunter Wilds. Starting off here at 1080p, borderless window because we don't have a full screen option. And we're playing from the medium preset. However, I am going to come in here and adjust our upscaling from performance to balanced. Frame generation, I'm actually going to leave off for 1080p. And I am going to actually turn off the ray tracing just to get a little bit more wiggle room here. Now, once we start counting our FPS here, you can see in a town, a village like this, getting in the 50s is actually pretty great because that is the more intensive area. Now, once we go into the open world area, you can see our FPS will start to climb a little bit, but what will also start to climb is our VRAM utilization slowly. So at 1080p, that is something that we do want to kind of keep an eye on as we kind of roam around here. But without frame generation, you can see we are actually staying beneath our 8GB VRAM allowance, which is awesome. And we are getting a pretty nice and fluid frame time graph and real solid experience here. It actually feels pretty solid, and responsiveness feels good. This isn't a game that needs to be like super ultra responsive, but here at balanced, using DLSS, it looks great. There is some weirdness going on in some areas, like you can see off in the distance. The trees look kind of weird, even like up close. Looks kind of weird, it looks kind of goofy, but the game looks solid here. I don't really have a ton of complaints as far as our visual quality goes. At 1080p, our VRAM is not an issue. Frame time graph is relatively flat. It's a decent experience here with a good balance of both performance and quality. So here at 1080p, not really a huge issue here. Nothing is really jumping out to me as being like unplayable or anything like that. Now, keeping those same settings and only adjusting the resolution up to 1440p, it's a little bit of a different story as we start counting. You can see we are getting below 60 pretty much all the time, not really jumping up above 60 unless we like stare at the sky or do something weird like that. Game does look, of course, a lot sharper at 1440p, especially utilizing just balance upscaling, nothing really super major as we're kind of running around here. This game also, it is important to note, it does, kind of, it does vary the performance depending on what you're doing, but, this is sub 60 here at 1440p. Our VRAM actually is holding on, which is actually pretty nice. The biggest setting that will impact our performance is the level of our textures. But the textures, just normal gameplay running around like this, the textures are really not going to be something that jumps out to you. Now, if you jump off and are walking around in person here, you can definitely come across some not so great textures. But here, 1440p, I want to get above 60 FPS. So let's go ahead and try some things. First thing I'm going to do is real simple, just bump it down to performance DLSS, and that gets us pretty close here. It doesn't get us quite to 60, but it does give us a little bit of a boost. Not super noticeable, probably not enough, but the image quality still looks decent. This is a title that I would feel a little more comfortable, although it is multiplayer. I wouldn't feel too uncomfortable with injecting in a transformer model here to get, slightly better picture quality on performance or ultra performance. But we're still not getting 60 here, but we are getting 50, so it is a decent candidate here for that frame generation, which is actually recommended by the game's developers. So if we come in here and just enable our frame generation, we'll get an extra like 60 to 70% FPS typically. So where we were getting in the 40s, now we're getting in the 70s, and it certainly feels a lot smoother. There is some input latency. It's not absolutely like unbearable or anything like that, but it is slightly noticeable. But a game like this, you don't really absolutely need like super fast response times. Really what you're doing is just like timing your counters and things like that, which is certainly doable even with frame generation on. It's really not a massive issue here. You can see, you know, even with, you know, lots of effects going on, we're still holding pretty strong as far as our FPS goes, still averaging above 60 so long as we do utilize our frame generation here. But actually pretty impressed here with the performance that we're getting. Actually pretty happy. You know, this is not a easy game to run. Our VRAM is kind of getting a bit high, but we're still not actually getting up into where that 8 gigabytes is throttling us. And if it were to, there are options for us as far as dumping down textures and things like that, but looks like we're right up against that VRAM limit right now. Not quite breaking into that 8 plus to where it would meaningfully, like, really tank our FPS. Now, that could vary. I could definitely see that changing depending on where exactly we are in the game and what we're doing. But as of right now, you know, in this area, it's certainly a real solid experience even at 1440p. So definitely kind of surprised and definitely happy with this. Next up here, we have Marvel Rivals. We are in Season 2, so not that Season 1 versus Season 2 makes a huge world of difference, but we are in the new season, the most modern update of the game. And we are starting off here at 1080p DLSS set quality. No frame generation, of course, you know, competitive games like this don't typically, you know, they're not a good match with frame generation, and we're playing on high settings here. So here, getting started here, you can see 1080p here, DLSS set to quality, which essentially looks native. We didn't inject the transformer model. You can, however, you know, there is some concern over injecting those, you know, models and editing game files in multiplayer games. I don't think anyone's gotten banned or anything for doing that, but it is a possibility. And you can see at 1080p, the image quality, in my opinion, looks basically native. You know, Marvel Rivals is another Unreal Engine 5 game, so it does use that, you know, TAA that Epic uses, but NVIDIA DLSS on NVIDIA cards certainly looks much better most of the time. You can see here with a lot going on, we're averaging right around, we'll go ahead and restart counting. Looks like we had a bit of a dip, maybe a bit inaccurate here compared to what we were getting before, but around 100 here at 1080p. Not amazing, but certainly playable. You know, most of the time you typically want maybe a bit better than this, especially at 1080p using DLSS, but it is an intensive game, so it's not super surprising that we're not getting major FPS here. But this is, you know, sacrificing basically nothing when it comes to image quality. You know, DLSS at quality basically looks native, and we're also playing on high settings, which includes ray tracing for the global illumination. So it is utilizing those RT cores that are, of course, one of the advantages of these, you know, NVIDIA cards. So, you know, able to get such a clean-looking picture and great visuals here at 100 plus FPS is certainly pretty nice. All right, switching over now to 1440p. Same settings otherwise, DLSS set to quality and high settings. Go ahead and start counting here. So here, really what I'm just looking for is 60 plus FPS at 1440p. You may want a bit more than that. You know, typically if you're playing like a competitive game, you may want a bit more, but as far as 1440p, you are pushing a lot more pixels, so it is nice to see. It's a nice timing here with all these ultimates going on. Still getting, you know, 80 FPS average, and really looks pretty solid. So yeah, definitely happy with the performance here. You know, the Unreal Engine 5 is not a super well optimized engine, that's no secret, and it's nice to see that even on a multiplayer title like this, you are able to get both, you know, high refresh rate experience here and also really clean looking visuals here. So 1440p is probably what I'd go out here. Definitely if I had a 1440p monitor, you know, I'd really only use 1080p for a 1440p monitor if I was having major trouble and even, you know, the upscaling wasn't getting me there. But this is definitely a real solid experience here in Marvel Rivals. Pleasantly surprised here. Next up here, we have Marvel Spider-Man 2, starting off at 1080p here. We're using DLSS set to quality on the high preset and the high ray tracing preset. So at 1080p, you can see it's not looking great here. We are getting certainly a playable frame rate, you know, above 60 average. Typically, this game does vary a ton depending on what you're looking at. It's actually funny for people who don't know that. Sometimes I'll see YouTubers benchmark this game and they're like, oh, it's getting terrible FPS. And then, you know, they'll look up and they'll be like, oh, well, it shot up for some reason. The averages are all over the place. It's really like what you're looking at. You know, if I look up, you can see we're up in like, you know, triple what we're getting typically. But for typical gameplay here, you can see 1080p with ray tracing, which is pretty intensive in this game. And in my opinion, it's not really worth it all the time. You can see, you know, flying around like this, doing like more what you'd typically be doing in some of this combat. You can see we're dipping pretty wildly. It's really, this is a hard game to benchmark because the FPS does, you know, really go all over the place depending on what exactly you're doing. So it is something to consider. But you can see, you know, 63 average, and more than just the benchmark and the numbers, what's more important is how the game feels. And to be honest, the game feels okay here. I wouldn't hate it, but just because I know this is 1080p and we do want to get at least something playable for 1440p, I think we might have to sacrifice the ray tracing. So when I talk about ray tracing, it's important to note, like, and there you can see a stutter, which is just the game. But it's important to note what exactly is the ray tracing in this game. You can see a big part of it is the puddles. That's, you know, almost like a meme in this game at this point. You know, the puddles that were shown at E3 when the game was showcased, or not even this game, when the original game was showcased all those, you know, years ago. And then it's mostly the reflections in the windows and things like that. So when we come up to, you know, a particular building, if you find a good one here, you can see when we come up to it, there's these nice reflections of the city. And they're all real-time reflections, and it is a nice look, you know, coming across buildings like that. It is nice, but for a game like this, I think it's far more important that you have smoother gameplay, just because so much of what makes this game feel good to play is having like real smooth web swinging and action and things like that. So I don't think personally that the ray tracing is super worth, like the juice is not really worth the squeeze in this instance, in my personal opinion. But, you know, this is a playable frame rate at 1080p at ray tracing. But, you know, in my opinion, you'd probably rather have a bit higher, and you're not really missing out on much, as you'll see in a minute. Now, before we do that, I do want to just show kind of what you can, and the only reason I'm showing this a bit out of order is because you do have to load in the ray tracing shaders separately, which is kind of a bummer. And not great for benchmarking because you can't really show the settings in the order that I would prefer to. But we'll go ahead and see. You can see we're getting right around 70 FPS average here. And we'll go ahead and see where that drops to when we turn it up to 1440p. So you can see here, just 1440p, that's the only difference we made. We're still on high, both the high preset and high ray tracing preset. Go ahead and start counting here. So this is part of the reason why I just don't think ray tracing is worth it at a certain point. Maybe if you're playing at 1080p, you know, and you're okay with 60 FPS and some of those weird dips. But as soon as we go up a little bit to 1440p, our VRAM is fine. That's not an issue, even at quality preset. But what is a problem is just this is not a super great experience as far as our FPS. And I wouldn't, for a game like this, I wouldn't really love to implement frame generation unless we were already at like 60, 70 FPS. At 1080p, you can certainly enable the frame generation if you'd like to. It wouldn't be super bad. But at 1440p here, not really something that I would personally recommend. But let's go back to 1080p now and dump down some of those ray tracing settings and see just how much performance we are sacrificing to get that ray tracing. Alright, so back to 1080p here, and still on the high preset, just with ray tracing turned off now. You'll see just how much more smooth this is. This is flying around the city, which is the more intensive thing you can do. You can see we're in the 90s here. And really, as far as the visual quality goes and the ray tracing, you know, the buildings, they still have like reflections, like they're completely flat. They're just not real-time reflections. You still do get shadows, and the lighting still looks pretty good. You know, it's not quite as amazing, but it's still really good. And of course, if we look up or down, you can see just how crazy that, you know, happens. But you can see if we get into like a fight here, just how much more fluid this is. And there's a lot more faith, in my opinion, in just like, I know that this will perform well. I'm not really worried about it. So that to me is worth more than the little visual, difference when it comes to ray tracing, which is nice. I'm not going to say it's not nice, but I just don't think it's worth it at on this particular hardware. I think I wouldn't like to implement really the frame generation, to be honest, if I could help it. So I'd prefer to kind of just go without the ray tracing, still get a good experience here, and still get really good looking visuals with a more native without frame generation refresh rate. So you can see here flying around here 100 FPS average and feels absolutely great. We'll see how this translates if we go over to 1440p now. Okay, so now back to 1440p, high preset, ray tracing turned off. And we'll go ahead and start counting here. So this is basically what we were getting at 1080p with ray tracing on, maybe even a bit better. And at 1440p looks super sharp, looks really great, and we're not sacrificing that performance nearly as much. So it's just my personal opinion. If you like the ray tracing and you want to make some of those compromises of using either frame generation or more aggressive upscaling, you're welcome to do that. My opinion, just not really worth the performance impact. And you can see even here at 1440p, VRAM's not an issue. The 8 gigabytes is handling it just fine. I do think in general, I almost want to make a whole nother video about it, but I think in general people do kind of they overvalue VRAM. If VRAM is an issue in a particular game, it will be a huge issue, and that's not to be undermined. But in a lot of games, even at these premium, anything above 1080p really is a premium resolution. 8 gigabytes of VRAM often is plenty to get you through with a very playable experience, and it's not always worth just looking at that VRAM number. And I do think sometimes people just, because when you look at a box on a graphics card, it basically just says the name of the graphics card, and the only other spec that's really on the box is the VRAM. And I do think people get hung up on that just a little too much. Now, having that VRAM is nice, but as you can see, a game like this, it really wouldn't, if we had 16, 24 on these settings, it wouldn't make any difference in our performance. It's really only if you are limited by your VRAM is when it starts to hit you with performance. And if it does hit you with performance, you do have ways around it, but if it does hit you with performance, especially if you're playing at 4K or something like that, or if a particular title is super VRAM intensive, which another one we're going to take a look at very soon is one that I know is VRAM intensive, then yes, it will make a difference. But in a lot of games, it doesn't really make as much of a difference as people sometimes make it out to be. All right, next up here, we have The Last of Us Part 2. Now, one quick note on this game, it does have a weird feature. Some people like it, some people don't, where it loads in your shaders during gameplay. And there's no way to do it before gameplay. So if you have a weak CPU, depending on the resolution that you're playing at, all the settings you're playing at, if you're using a CPU that is underpowered, it may affect performance because your CPU usage is going to shoot up during gameplay just always because it's loading in those shaders as you're playing. The benefit is you're not sitting here at the main menu waiting for them to load in ahead of time. Many people didn't mind that if it meant for smoother gameplay, but regardless, your performance may be different depending on the CPU that you have. We are running on a pretty high-end CPU that will be able to manage this without any performance impact for the GPU, but it's not always the case. I don't love this implementation of the shaders, but it is what it is. It's what we have until they change it or add an option. This is kind of our default. We're starting off here at 1080p full screen using anti-aliasing just at TAA, meaning that we are not using any sort of upscaling. So this is at native resolution on the medium preset. So this is kind of what you can expect here in certain situations. Of course, I'm very early in the game, and maybe I'm a bit premature to be benchmarking this game because I haven't really found a great spot. But for this indoor area here, you can see a few things. Notably, our CPU usage is off the charts. But really, here at 1080p, native resolution, we're actually really getting pretty solid FPS here. And the game does look pretty incredible here. A lot of what makes these Naughty Dog ports and these Naughty Dog titles so good is that they put a ton of effort into all this pre-baked stuff. So they don't really utilize ray tracing or anything like that, and they don't really need to because the game just kind of is built in at such great settings. So even without utilizing DLSS. And of course, I imagine as the game goes on, different more open world environments, it may become a bit, this 122 FPS may not hold up, but I'm not there yet. I will definitely revisit the game as I'm further into it, but just as a baseline, we'll go ahead and compare this. Again, this is 1080p at medium settings at native resolution with no upscaling and TAA anti-aliasing, and absolutely beautiful picture quality here, and yeah, looks really great. Now, coming up to 1440p at same medium settings, we're still getting a 60 plus FPS experience, but it is actually a pretty noticeable drop here down into the 80s, 90s at times. Of course, like I said, this is probably not the best benchmarking, but I just kind of wanted to show the game. I'm sure it's a game that people have been interested in, and a game that I've heard is actually really well optimized. So I'm not super surprised to see that, even at 1440p native resolution, it's getting solid performance here in indoor areas. The game is not super fast moving. You typically have time to load in areas. It was built for the PS4, which didn't have nearly the horsepower of a 4060. So yeah, looks really great. I'll definitely revisit it. And important to know that, even if we needed to, it does support DLSS. So as you can see here, if we go ahead and turn off this overlay, we do still have not only DLSS that we can turn on, we also have frame generation as a fallback here. So there are certainly a lot of things that we could do to improve our performance if we weren't happy with the FPS, or if it did meaningfully change, depending on the setting or the environment of a particular area of the game. All right, next up here we have Red Dead Redemption 2. Starting off here at 1080p full screen, VSeek set to off, and we're playing at max quality settings at completely native bare bones resolution. So no anti-aliasing of any kind, no DLSS, TAA, FXAA, or MSAA. So this is completely native, which isn't great because you do get some of these jaggies, as you can see. Off in the distance, you can also see some of that like hazy stuff. So this game doesn't look great at native resolution, but we'll kind of just come in here just to kind of see what kind of performance that you might expect here at native. And as we start riding around, especially at 1080p, the no anti-aliasing looks terrible with all these trees and things like that. Just looks all speckly, super jagged edges. Doesn't look great, but we are getting solid FPS here, as you can see. In the 80s at completely native 1080p. Looks great. As far as the picture quality, definitely looks, real clean. It's just the anti-aliasing or lack thereof doesn't look great. Typically, like on consoles, it uses a form of TAA by default, which is not a bad form of anti-aliasing, but is not nearly as good as DLSS, which has the added benefit of not only giving you some anti-aliasing, smoothing out those jaggies, but also improves your performance. So we'll go ahead and enable just quality DLSS and see what kind of performance we can get with that. You can see we're right around 80 completely native. We should be getting a better picture quality and better performance. So we're just going to put it to quality here, leave sharpening exactly where it's at, and apply. And you can see already the picture should look much, much cleaner. I'll go ahead and make sure I zoom in to show that difference, but the trees and things like that look much, much cleaner, on top of the fact that we have gotten pretty much a 15 FPS performance increase here at while also getting a better picture quality. It's just one of the great things about NVIDIA cards. They get hated on for a number of reasons, and a lot of them are very warranted, but at the end of the day, the DLSS technology is pretty much unmatched. So we are here getting, really solid FPS and really clean picture quality. This is definitely a game that 60 FPS to 120 FPS, anything above 60 I'd be happy with, and I'd definitely prioritize visuals over performance in a title like this. So quality DLSS, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the best form of anti-aliasing for this particular title, looks absolutely amazing and gives you really, really solid performance here at 1080p. All right, so now we're here at 1440p again, full screen with VSync set to off, and we're at the max quality settings here with all forms of anti-aliasing turned off. Interesting to note here that when I change resolution, it actually automatically applied TAA. So it really wants you to use some form of anti-aliasing. However, just to see kind of what it looks like at native resolution here. We'll go ahead and start counting. So this is 1440p pure native max quality. And you can see even at 1440p, we still doesn't look great. As we start walking through, you can see those jaggies really start to become pretty evident. At 4K, anti-aliasing becomes less of a concern. You don't need to apply it at the higher resolution that you go. And it definitely doesn't look as bad here as it did at 1080p. But still not great. We are getting at completely raw, and the only reason I'm really doing this test is just to show what just raw pushing the pixels with no form of, anti-aliasing or upsampling or anything, what kind of performance you can get. And, we are getting 60 FPS, and just at the native resolution, that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is nowhere near being filled up. So we're definitely well within our limits on a card like this, and definitely have a little bit of room to spare. So yeah, 60 plus FPS experience here at 1440p, complete native max settings, which is really, really cool to see. Now let's see what we can get with that DLSS quality, which is typically how I would recommend to play. So again, only setting that we're changing here is just DLSS, not changing anything else from its default settings. All right, so here now with that DLSS quality, you can see it pretty much eliminates all of those jaggies. Everything looks real nice, still sharp, but just not as none of that weirdness going on off in the distance. And we're still getting 60 plus FPS. It's not giving us a major performance increase. I think we're getting like 62 before, now we're closer to 70, but definitely still a really solid performer here. And while this game is older, I believe it came out on PC in 2019 or 2018, it's still a really, really solid looking game. And a lot of people who I know who have switched over to PC, who were originally console gamers, this is one of those games that they do want to go back and re-experience at higher fidelity. So it is a game that I do like to test, on top of the fact that just in general, Rockstar games are really, really pretty well optimized on PC, which is just such a bummer that they don't release on PC at time of launch, but that's neither here nor there. But as you can see, we're up in the 70s here with DLSS set to quality, and picture quality looks absolutely spectacular. Couldn't really ask for better. It looks really, really solid. And yeah, not much else to say. 60 plus FPS in Red Dead Redemption 2 on a entry level, the bottom, tier card of the 40 series. Really, really happy with the performance here. And just goes to show you don't need to spend a ton of money on a GPU to get a good, performance on a great looking game like this. All right, so that was the 4060 at 1080p and 1440p, and really my main takeaways are, I can see why the card is so popular. If we add up these two percentages here, nearly 1 out of every 10 players are playing PC with a 4060, and I could see why. Of course, the 4060 laptop GPU is not exactly the same card, but a similar performance in a lot of cases. But it is just really impressive how far this card can push these titles. And, say what you will about NVIDIA, but their driver support is incredible. Cards with similar specs like the B580 that has, more video memory. Really, NVIDIA is right up there. And oftentimes their technologies with DLSS really shine in on this lower end of hardware. The other thing that really stood out to me is the 8 gigabytes of VRAM. People talk about it a lot, and I do think it is nice, and I do think 12 gigabytes should be the new standard across the board. I can't imagine it costs them that much money to just add in 4 gigabytes of VRAM to these lower end cards, but the 5060 is probably going to be coming out in the next few days here, like really, really soon. I am interested to check that card out. But just goes to show the 8 gigabytes, which looks like the 5060 is going to also have. I hate to say it, but in a lot of cases, it actually doesn't really matter. 8 gigabytes really can get you pretty far. So I can see where the card is coming from, and I do think the main thing that sticks out to me, if the 5060 releases and that becomes a super popular card, I'm really interested to see what happens to the used market for the 4060, because right now you can get a 4060 between $250 to $300, and if that goes down to like $200, or if it drops by $50, 200 to 250, somewhere in that price range, I think it becomes a super compelling option for budget builds. You know, if you can build out a $500, $600 PC with a 4060, that's a really good spot to be in. Those pre-builts are going for like $1,000 right now, so it just gives you another reason to kind of build your own computer. And really happily, you know, surprised with the 4060, and really, you know, impressed to see how well it's aged in the past 2 years. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any GPUs or any games in particular you want more of a deep dive on as far as testing different settings, feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to test them. But for now, thank you guys for watching. Take care.